Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to End of Life University podcast, where we share real talk about life and death. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and I want to thank you for joining me today for episode number 247. In just a few minutes, I'll be sharing with you my conversation with Lucinda Herring, who is a returning guest on the podcast, and we're talking about reimagining death during the COVID-19 pandemic. So stay tuned for that in just a moment. First, I'd like to thank my newest supporters on Patreon who signed up to help make a monthly contribution to keep this podcast on the air. Bob Hoffman, Elizabeth Copeland, and Patty Emmett. Thank you all so much for stepping up and making a contribution. If you're interested in learning how you can join our team, you can go to my page at Patreon, patreon.com/EOLU. And thanks again to everyone who's been supporting me for the last few years. It really makes a huge difference. I also just want to quickly let you know my book, 7 Lessons for Living from the Dying, is finally released and available for purchase online. Originally, I thought it would only be available as an ebook, but I was able to order a print book myself. So apparently there are some print books, which was a surprise to me. But I will leave links in the show notes for this episode at eolupodcast.com, where you can buy the book at various outlets online. And I'm also leaving links for a couple of interviews I've done with some YouTube hosts over the last week with Suzanne O'Brien of Doula Givers and Alexandra Wenman for her YouTube channel, and she's from London. So I'll leave links to those if you're interested in hearing the interviews that I did with them. So we'll get on with our interview now. As always, stay tuned, and after the interview, I'll come back with a few takeaways and to say goodbye. So here we go with my conversation with Lucinda Herring. Today, I'm happy to welcome my guest, Lucinda Herring, who has been on the podcast in the past. Lucinda is a home funeral green disposition consultant and guide, an interfaith minister, and a licensed funeral director in the state of Washington. She is also the author of the wonderful book, Reimagining Death, Stories and Practical Wisdom for Home Funerals and Green Burials. And you can learn more about Lucinda and her work and the book at reimaginingdeath.com. Lucinda, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Karen. It's a pleasure and honor to be here talking today.
Well, as we're recording this, we're still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the past month or so, I've had one episode where we talked about families who are not able to be with their loved ones who are ill or dying. And we talked about families making do with virtual funerals when they couldn't come together in order to have a funeral for a loved one. But I wanted to talk to you, Lucinda, in order to discuss the other end of the equation, families that have a loved one with them at home who is dying, because, even outside of the people experiencing COVID-19, we still have hospice patients who are being cared for at home and may be dying. We have lots of home caregivers who are taking care of older loved ones at home. And so on the other end of the spectrum, we have some people who have loved ones who are dying at home. And so I wanted you to be here with me to discuss that. But before we start on that issue, that question, Lucinda, would you just tell people a little bit about what you do as a home funeral and green disposition consultant and guide, just for people who aren't familiar with what your work is and how you got involved in this work?
Sure. Well, I help families remember really that we can care for our own dead in ways that we've forgotten. We've really turned to the funeral industry to care for our dead, and the normal thing is that we would call someone, a funeral director, within hours of a death, and have that person come and pick a our loved one up and take them to their care facility. And the home funeral means really staying at home for a time, really taking a time out of time right after someone dies to just have the spaciousness and the time you might need to be with that person and to care for them, their bodies, yourself, rather than call the funeral home right away. It's like the way we used to do it long ago. It's what the wake is in the Irish culture. So that is really what a home funeral is. It's more involved in that. But I got into it in 1997 because my friend Judy looked at a group of women and said, I don't want a funeral director to care for my body after death. Can you please do it? And we didn't know at the time that we could, but we found out that indeed it is legal in all 50 states of the country for family members to care for their own dead, and even to act as licensed funeral director themselves in every state but 9, where the funeral director and the funeral industry needs to be involved in the paperwork and in transport. But that means 41 states, the family can act as licensed funeral director and care for someone themselves, including transporting them to a crematory or to a burial, a cemetery. So we learned that we could do that, and that's a whole story. I've written about it a little bit in my book. It launched us into, we had such a transformative experience caring for Judy. When my mother died, I went home to Alabama and wanted to care for her as well, and I write about that in my book. I was deeply moved by my experience there, asking to care for my mother. So a question arose in my time with my mother's death that lives in my heart still, which is, what does it mean to partner with nature at the threshold of death? And that's translated into, what does it mean to really be more natural when someone dies, to follow our own instincts, to want to be with that person possibly after death, especially if we cared for them before death as well. What does it mean to choose more natural and ecological dispositions? All of these questions have led me to do what I do today.
Mm. And I would say that the majority of people probably choose what you described initially, the more traditional option. If a loved one does die at home, they call the funeral home. It may be one they've already had arrangements with or one they've chosen to come, and they come and remove the body from the home, and all of the other preparations are done outside the home and by other people. And so it still seems in our country, I'm not sure about the statistics, but that the majority of people are probably either not familiar with the idea that they could have a funeral at home, that it's possible and legal, and that it can actually be beautiful. And so I assume that's true, but I don't know what the actual statistics are.
Right. I don't know the actual statistics either. I do know that in the 20 years that I've been doing this work, at the beginning, it was really unknown and rare and quite a pioneering thing to do. And in those 20 years, a lot of consciousness raising about it has happened. We formed the National Home Funeral Alliance, which is, in every state and Canada and even in Great Britain and international. It's a membership of people who are reclaiming this support of families to participate and be more creative and be more hands-on with their loved one when they die. So I would say that as every year passes, the awareness of that is going to be broader, and the whole death positive movement with the younger generation, the whole movement of the death end of life doulas all of that is bringing a lot more awareness to these possibilities. And that's a really wonderful thing.
Yes. And I wanted to mention again that your book, Reimagining Death, is filled with beautiful stories that I think inspire people to see what is possible if you decide you would like to care for a loved one at home. And the book, I think, should be widely read to help people recognize that it's not that hard. It can be done, and that there are people out there who can assist and who can help for those who would like to have their loved one at home.
Yes, thank you. That was my intention in writing the book. And I wrote it, I made stories and practical wisdom and more how-to information, so that people could feel empowered to do it themselves. And of course, how one does it, it changes from state to state. So it's very important to look at your own state laws and what's available and what's not. All of that is on the National Home Funeral Alliance website. And I refer to those kind of resources, as well as many resources that are in the book that will, that people can look to and have, find the resources that are relevant for them. There's also 16 wonderful color photographs of families who have cared for their own dead at home, and green burial and conservation burial. And I always, say that a picture paints 1,000 words, and it really is true in this case, because none of us, or few of us, have experienced this kind of caring for our loved one. And it's almost like a threshold that you have to cross by experiencing it to know that you can do it, and that not only can you do it, but it gives so many wonderful gifts and experiences when you do have one. Yeah.
Yeah. And it sounds like ideally families would prepare for this in advance before their loved one dies. They would have known that this is something they'd like to pursue, so that they have time to, first of all, find out the laws in the state in which they live, but also just be somewhat prepared and have in mind what they might do. And I think because I think planning in advance will also help them in the moment when they're experiencing grief at the same time, to already have a picture in mind of what they plan to do for their loved one at home.
Yes, thank you. And my last chapter is about creating what I call an advanced after death care directive, which is the next step on from an advanced healthcare directive, which is before you die, right? What you would like before you die. And this advanced after death care directive is really the next step, what you would like afterwards. And particularly if you want something which is still considered alternative, really, a home funeral, and where families care for their own dead, and even natural burial, unfortunately, is still considered alternative right now, then it's important to think ahead and to really imagine what you want and how that might come about, given the limitations or whatever might be around your situation and in what state you're in. Mm-hmm. So yes, planning ahead is really, really helpful. I've definitely helped families, though, where they didn't plan ahead, and we still were able to help them have a home funeral. I mean, when a sudden death happens, it can be extraordinarily healing to be able to bring that person home to the house, and to have family and friends have a much more time to integrate the shock and the suddenness of the experience. So it is possible. It's not as easy, and maybe a bit more work to do to make that happen, but it is possible.
Mm. And that brings up something that you and I had discussed as we were getting ready for this conversation today, is the fact that right now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, some families are facing the situation of having a loved one at home, and they may have had no intention of having a home funeral. Their expectation may have been that they would do the standard phone call to the funeral home who would come to remove the body, but they're finding that is not happening in a timely manner because funeral directors are really overwhelmed right now in some communities by the numbers of deaths that they're having to handle. And so you were mentioning stories of some people who are keeping the body at home for hours and sometimes even a full day while they wait for the funeral director to come. And that's something I wanted to talk to you about. How can we help those people who are not prepared at all to sit with the dead body of their loved one in their own home?
Yes, I'm so glad we're able to talk about this. In a way, it's like the title of my book. It's reimagining what is happening instead of seeing it as a trauma or something that shouldn't be happening, that you have your loved one at home, then turning that around and creating a different kind of story about it to oneself, and seeing that there could be actual wonderful gifts that can happen from it. So I want to talk about that a minute. I just saw an article that I put a quote down talking about that, they've even had to bring out the military to help pick up bodies because the funeral directors are so overwhelmed. This is in New York, I think. They've picked up 4,700 bodies in a matter of days, or it was just very overwhelming. And there was a quote that said, "Some survivors have reported waiting hours in the presence of the dead for the military units to arrive." And, it was written in the article, greater stress, which it perhaps was because people are not used to having to wait. So one thing I'd love to, put out in this podcast for people listening is that, even the way that quote was written, waiting hours in the presence of the dead can be such an amazingly sacred gift in my experience and in the experience of so many families I've helped. Being able to literally be in the presence of the dead and see that as a gift and a time out of time, a liminal space that we don't normally give ourselves. Even when maybe our whole bodies and our whole hearts are longing for that time to be there and just a little longer. It's quite shocking. I know we've all experienced this when someone dies at home and then the funeral director does come within an hour or so. And, suddenly that person is being wrapped up and taken out the door. And there's this great feeling of longing for, just difficulty, in watching that person be rolled away. So being able to have the time can be really, really helpful, as long as in your own mind and heart you can see it that way. And so I think that there's an opportunity here for families to just take their time, to go get a cup of tea, to go outside if they can and find some flowers and some tree branches and things that, you can come in. I've given this a lot of thought. One of the important things to do and wonderful is to shift the energy in the room, when someone has just died, and take some of the medical equipment away and straighten the covers and open a window for some fresh air and bring in some flowers and candles. Just clean the room of, things of daily life and make it a little bit more set apart and sacred, I would say. And in doing that, then it's very calming. It's a very calming thing to do if you're stressed, as I'm sure families would be and are in these situations with COVID. It's an opportunity to really just calm down and to breathe. And, I'm thinking about the difference in being able to do that and then not being able to be with your loved one at all if the person has died in the hospital, where you can't even tell that person goodbye. Having the person right there in the home while you're waiting for the funeral director to come and pick them up is becoming, in this time of COVID, an actual tangible gift of time and opportunity.
And it really is asking us to change our relationship with death, because the only reason we find it uncomfortable or traumatic to have the body of a loved one stay in our house longer is simply because in our society, we're just not used to it. We're not familiar with it, but there's nothing wrong with it. And there's nothing even really frightening about it. We just have to change our mindset around it.
Right. And it's interesting, how so many in my families, often a family member will say, I just cannot do that. I can't imagine doing that. And I won't be involved. They'll opt out. And then when it happens, they're so amazed at how normal it feels and how beautiful it can be. I mean, bringing beauty to that situation with the flowers and with beautiful cloths and candles, good music that the person loved. It's so comforting that often those who are most resistant are the ones who are most involved. In my experience, often they'll end up being very involved and very moved and transformed by the experience. So that fear and resistance is something that we all have. Like I said, because none of us have experienced this in our time very often. But once we relax into it, the gifts are very, present.
Mm-hmm. And I do so remember when my mother died, the situation you described. The hospice nurse who was there with us called the funeral home, and they actually came very quickly. I was surprised. I thought it might take a little longer for them to get there, and I really did feel deprived of time I would have wanted to have with her, and this terrible emptiness and loneliness in her house once she was gone. And so I totally resonate with what you're saying, the gift of time and time to just slow down and to relax for a moment when there's nothing to do, nothing that has to be done. All of the relief, in a way, of all the care we've been trying to provide is no longer needed, and all the worries and fears we've had are now gone. And now there's a moment to simply be in that space and be at peace with our loved one. I would have cherished that, but like probably most people, I didn't get to have that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think we don't even know we need it until we need it, right? We don't know until the moment emerges that we need it. And any kind of conversations like we're having can be so helpful to just reimagine what is possible, and what we might want and feel. Just actually imagine into that. If someone, is going to die at home, and what would you ideally want if you could really have it, and then see that extra time as a vehicle for that to be possible. I'm thinking of, what it must feel like, though, in a situation where someone at home is dying of COVID. I mean, the level of stress, the difficulty of these deaths, some of them, the lack of breathing. I think the level we're talking about a level of stress, often where hospice is not involved, to come in and help with pain management or fear and anxiety. I think the levels of stress are ramped up so much. And so I would say that for anyone who is going through this or will go through this with someone at home, just to truly breathe and see more time to just grapple with what is happening, see it as an opportunity and a gift, because it will help the people around the person who's died to be calm, right? And to not hold an energy field of stress for themselves and also for the person who's died. I really feel I've seen that so much in my work, almost a relaxation in the person who's died in their body when things calm down and when people bring beauty and nature and singing and whatever, tell stories. It basically, we're companioning the dead still. We're doing what we instinctively still want to do, which is companion them for a time after they've crossed over.
Yes, and who better to be the companions for our dead than us ourselves, we who love them, not a professional, a stranger who comes in and, removes them from our presence. And so I love the idea of trying to help normalize this in a way for people that some of us are going to have loved ones die at home, and we may have this experience of being there alone. And how can we reimagine it to be, as you said, a beautiful experience? I love that idea of bringing in flowers or candles, or I was thinking even like a beautiful scarf that you could lay across the body, and music and telling stories or reading poetry or anything to just bring beauty into the room. And I think that will be a huge antidote to the fear and dread that people might feel around it.
I do too. I mean, one wonderful thing is watching when people can be creative, when they're asked out of themselves to bring something to the occasion. Just being able to be creative in that moment is so strengthening. It's so strengthening and supportive of that person. So imagine there is someone who's just died a hard death. And so that person goes outside for a moment and takes a breath and sits down on the earth in the yard, or on a garden chair somewhere, and just feels the wind and the trees next to them supporting them. And then they find these flowers, these little violets that are growing here in the spring, and they think of doing something and then they see a daffodil, or they see these other things, and they bring those flowers in, and then just instinctively they go to that person and create this mandala of beauty on the body of the person who has died. And it's such a just even feeling into that myself, imagining it. It's such a offering of healing for what has just happened.
Wow, that just, your story caused a memory to come back for me of a few years ago. My niece died of breast cancer, and I had been intending to go visit her and be there for her, and she died before I was able to get back to see her. So I was in another state when she died, and I was upset with myself for not getting there to be there with her, or at least to see her one more time before she died. And I went out for a walk by a river that's near our house. And on the walk, I saw a rose bush full of pink wild roses, beautiful pink, which was my niece's favorite color. And I picked a few of the blossoms thinking, oh my gosh, she would love this. And on the rest of the walk, I saw, as you were describing, all kinds of other flowers on the side of the road that I don't know why I hadn't noticed them before, but suddenly when I was tuned in, I saw these flowers until I had just 2 hands full of different types of blossoms. And I stopped alongside the river, and on a tree stump, I made a mandala, just as you described, with all of those flowers, so that I could appreciate the beauty of them together. And then one by one, I tossed them into the river and watched them flow away. And that became my little farewell ritual for my niece, that brought me all this comfort, even though I wasn't able to be there and be with her and be there with my brother at that moment. But I think these simple little rituals are very impactful and very important. And it seems like our society has not cultivated rituals. We haven't done a good job of maintaining and creating rituals for situations like this.
Yes, that's such a beautiful story, Karen. Thank you. And as you were talking, I realized how relevant your story is to this other thing we were discussing and are concerned about, which is not being able to be with someone who's died of COVID in the hospitals, and having it happen so quickly at times. And, the amount of grief around that and trauma is so intense. And I just love thinking that someone could go and do something very similar to what you did, right? Out in nature and by the river or wherever, whatever place is comforting to a person where they live nearby them, and creating some work of art, some offering to the person who's died, because you can't be with them, because you can't be hands-on. And have any kind of tangible and sensory bodily experience that person has died. Makes it so much more traumatic, I think. So anything we can do to come back to our bodies and to our senses and to create art in the face of death is just so part of what we are learning. And I actually think we're learning it. We're in the fast lane. We're in, right now having to learn it out of sheer necessity.
I think you're exactly right. I was thinking that as well, that one thing that we're learning is that love is not limited by space and time, and that we really are learning. We're getting to practice. I can love my loved one at a distance. I don't have to be physically in the same room to convey my love to that person. I can send love to them. I can experience all the love I have. And as you were talking about, I can create something beautiful with all this love I have for this person, and it's still powerful. It doesn't lose anything. It's just as powerful as if I could have been in the room with her. I can still make something beautiful for her, to honor her, and actually feel like I've sent that message to her. Like she knows that. she understood that, and understood that I couldn't be with her physically.
Yeah. And that is still companioning her, right? I feel like it's a deep companioning of that person who has died. And if we think about these people who are dying really hard deaths in ICU, they more than anything need this companioning, I believe. So companioning from afar, and saying, I'm here, I'm still here, I'm here with you. I'm accompanying you in my heart, and making these offerings to you. They're very tangible ways, not just to comfort ourselves, but maybe to comfort those who have died,
Yes. I was thinking of even seeing the healthcare workers who are caring for our loved ones in the hospital as our hands of love, in a way. Like our love can flow to our loved ones through those healthcare workers who are bringing them comfort and caring for them, that they can actually be surrogates in a way for us and for our love and our presence. And I've been hearing stories all the time of healthcare workers talking about holding a patient's hand, of sitting in the room with them, of, getting an intuitive hit that they should go check on a patient and walking in the room at just the right time to be present with them as they were dying. And so all the love that we would like to give physically by being present with our loved one is still flowing to them, but through other people who are there to help them.
Yes, and it's so beautiful, isn't it? Because as you were describing that, I was, feeling like if someone is the hands that I wish were mine, then we are so connected to that healthcare worker, right? Through our longing and our love. And asking them to be our hands, it just really underlines the interdependence we all are together, how we are each other in some ways.
Yes.
It breaks down the barriers of separation, doesn't it, between ourselves. Yeah.
Yes. And I think, as you were saying, as we look at it, I think these really are lessons that we're being asked to learn right now. We're being asked in a very challenging and difficult way, but there's so much here for us to gain by going into these situations, at least with an open mind and an open heart, and reimagining, as the word that you used in your book, and being creative in the moment. And I feel like once we're on the other side of this, whatever that is, whenever that may come, we are all going to be much different people for having gone through this experience. We're learning so much about how to connect, but connecting even in non-local ways, connecting with each other and seeing how much we need each other in ways we haven't really looked at before.
Right. And it means that I think we will be more aware that we are much larger than we think. We're much larger and more layered. We have these capacities, I would say subtle capacities, right? Or not just physical, that we have these subtle and spiritual capacities that we may not have even realized until we're forced really to open enough to understand that indeed who we are.
Yes, that's so beautiful. Well, Lucinda, I also wanted to talk to you about the idea of green burial and some thoughts that you have on why we need to be open-minded about the disposition after a person has died right now too, and consider alternatives there.
Yeah, so I've had wonderful experiences in the last 6 weeks of green burials here in my community. They're just wonderful stories that I won't tell right now, but one of the main things was realizing how healing, again, it can be to choose a green burial for one's choice of disposition. How that can be for the family, because often with a green or natural burial, the family is participating, just as they are in a home funeral, creatively to make that burial happen. And I just want to go back and define green burial versus conventional burial for people who are listening who may not know. It's really the burying someone the way we used to do, where you dig the grave and the person is placed directly into the grave without the cement vaults and without embalming. So, and with a biodegradable casket or shroud or container, so that everything that is put in the earth is not toxic to the earth, but is natural and gives back to the earth in the decomposition of the body. In fact, the way a green burial works is that the depth of the grave is not as much as 6 feet as a conventional burial, but 3.5 to 4 feet, because the layers of aerobic and bacteria and fungi and little critters who help with decomposition are way more available at that shallower depth. So the whole idea is to make decomposition more efficient rather than preventing decomposition, which is what our conventional burial practices have evolved into, with the big concrete vaults and the metal steel caskets and the embalming. All of that is in a way a kind of preservation rather than supporting the decomposition and dissolution of the body back to the earth.
And so again, reimagining is required in order to see the only reason that we do burial the way we have. It's just simply a convention that we started 100 years ago or so, and that it isn't really necessary or required, that we can return to a more natural form of burial and allow decomposition and be much more in sync with the cycle of nature and the cycle of life and death, instead of trying to resist it and trying to prevent it.
Yes, that's right. And, you're also really with the reality of the person being dead, just as you are when you care for someone at home in a home funeral. You have, again, a bodily somatic experience that person that you love has died, and that the body in front of you no longer has the same life force, and the person is no longer there in the same way. And what I've seen in my experience with this kind of burial is that people are just given, again, the opportunity to fully know, the reality of death, and to be in relationship to it, to not be afraid. These 2 burials that I've just experienced were extraordinary in that the young couples, the sons and daughters of my friend Kelly, who died, and my friend Rini, who died, who were all grandparents, their children and their grandchildren helped dig the graves. And then the children were there with the bodies, and seeing their grandparents there, beautifully covered with flowers and shrouds and paintings. And just bringing the beauty for the children was something extraordinary to observe. And then the children helped fill in the graves, and they even danced on the graves at the end. And it was just so amazing to experience the lack of fear, the even level of joy and celebration of that person, and this very deep acceptance. I know that those children are going to grow up with a whole different relationship to death, and so this is what the home funerals offer and green burials offer. Is this deep participation in laying someone to rest.
And I can imagine that going through home funeral and green burial is very helpful for the grieving process too, that it helps you have a different relationship to the death of the person by having this hands-on approach, and, as you said, having this somatic experience of recognizing that this person is dead, and we're giving over their body now for the next step of what takes place in this natural cycle. It seems to me that is helpful with the process of grief.
Oh, so much so. Because in a way it's so real, it's so real, and you've created a container for all emotions to be there. It's not like in the scenario I just painted that people weren't crying, and just crying and crying, or then just getting up and, continuing to fill in the grave. And there's room for every emotion, I think, when you create this kind of container of participation. And so you feel more real in some strange way, or not really strange. You feel more alive in the face of death, because you've given yourself the permission to just be yourself, really. And that's what these more natural ways of caring for the dead offer.
And that seems so important right now. Just this morning, I was writing in my journal something similar to that about COVID-19 has removed our illusions that we can cheat death or outwit death. And it has taken that illusion away and brought us face to face with death. And yet that is the moment at which we can feel the most alive and appreciate our life the most and get something out of every moment that we have.
Yes, that's right. I mean, in a way, we're being forced to weave death back into our lives, right? We've relegated it to the shadows, really, for so long. And we're being forced to have it come back into our lives and then figure out what we're going to do about it, how we're going to meet it. I mean, I remember a story from an ER doctor that I read. I don't know all the details of, but you know how in our medical profession, death is something to be like a failure, right? And I know doctors and nurses must be feeling that as well, with these terrible numbers of death happening and feeling so helpless. But at the same time, they're in relationship to death over and over all day long. And this one ER doctor, he started making a practice of looking really deeply into the person's eyes before they put them on a ventilator, knowing full well that person might die, as they went on the ventilator. And just, I mean, when he wrote that, I had that same feeling, Karen, that, my gosh, this man is staring right into the eyes of death. And taking a moment to do that because out of his own desperation, and feeling of helplessness. I mean, I'm obviously interpreting what he said, not necessarily what he felt, but I was so struck with the presence of death in the hospitals in such a large way that there's no running from it. And there's no time even to think it's a failure. There's just time to meet it to the best of your ability.
Wow. Yes, that's such a powerful observation. Whereas prior to the pandemic, I think doctors and nurses at times could walk away from death, even in the hospital, and not necessarily be present with it. But there's no way out. There's no escape from it now.
Right. I think that's right. Yeah. So we are all going to be different after this. And, my hope is that it is going to transform the way that we hold and view death in medical situations and in our lives. And it's why I do this work. I have such a passion for the home funeral and green burial work, because it's supporting and empowering people to weave death back into life in life-giving, creative, and comforting ways. Yeah.
And I'm so appreciative to you, Lucinda, for how long you've been doing this work and beginning in this kind of work, even when no one else had heard of it. But I feel as though perhaps it's partly been in preparation for what we're going through right now as our own society and country, but the entire world, the entire planet is experiencing the same thing. And that all the groundwork you laid and all the foundations that you created through this work you've been doing for 20 years happen to be here at exactly the right time when we really need these resources that you offer.
Thank you, Karen. Yes, I do feel that. I feel like I'm one of many, who have just been quietly reimagining,
Yes.
quietly reimagining a different story, a different possibility, and of how we are living and dying. Yes, I do, and yeah.
And speaking of your book, Reimagining Death, Stories and Practical Wisdom for Home Funerals and Green Burials, it feels to me that that's a book that anyone could read. You don't have to be someone who's interested in becoming a death doula or a green burial guide to read this book. It seems this was my feeling about it, and I'm asking, I guess, if that's how you wrote it, but it seems that it's accessible to anyone who might read it who would like to learn more.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad that you feel that way. I did try to write it in that way. I'm a storyteller, and I wanted to tell the stories. And I have this deep longing to ease the process of death for people. I think that has a lot to do with how I tried to write the book, and a lot to do with the work itself. Is what can we do to ease this process of suffering and grief and loss? How can we make it more part of normal life, to normalize it, but also to support people to relax around it enough to even know what they feel? I think that helps with the grieving process. So I have this, I think people who go through these kind of more participatory ways of caring for our loved ones don't have the same journey of grief afterwards. Mm-hmm. It's not that they don't grieve for a long, long time. It's just that they don't have the same kind of grieving. It's not as frozen or, how when we don't want to feel our pain, we defend ourselves against it. We kind of freeze somatically in our bodies, and we repress it, and we just want to go on with our lives. And if we do the opposite of that and try to open to the experience, however painful, try to open and relax into it, into the pain itself, then it's as if we're carried almost in a different way. We're supported in a different way. Mm. And it changes the nature of grieving, I've seen, to do that. And I would like to underline that, because I think, with people losing people from COVID and not being able to even be in a relationship to them, it's going to be really tempting to shut down and to not feel, because it's so unbearable. And so whatever we can do to support people to, however painful, keep opening to the support of others, and opening to our own just raw, fierce feelings, and doing art around that, and being in nature, all of the things that can help us relax more or remain soft, I guess is a good way to say it. Remain soft rather than frozen.
And that's a good reminder for all of us, even those of us who may not have a loved one who has died through this. We're all experiencing, though, the collective grief, because it's enormous, it's immense. And we're all experiencing our own grief in a way over just the change in our day-to-day lives. So it's a good reminder for all of us not to shut down, not to resist the emotions that are coming over us, but as you said, to soften and open up to it and allow ourselves to just experience it.
Yes, and it's really scary. That's scary to do. And so I think we have to do it with each other, whether it's on Zoom meetings or with our just immediate family. I mean, what happened last week when my friend Rini died was that of course, all her friends could not be at the green burial, just the family could be, because of social distancing. And they came in their cars and drove around the cemetery with flowers all over the cars and Reenie's name in big letters and love. We love you, Reenie. They were suffering so much because they couldn't help with the home funeral and they couldn't help with the burial when they were all slated to be totally part of it. And I got, got feedback afterwards that it was just so helpful to be in the car together, like to be in that train of cars together.
Yes.
Yeah. And then I also had the idea of everybody bringing flowers from their garden the night before the burial and bring them to the grave. And that I got feedback too was so helpful again, because they had that time in their own gardens to find something beautiful and then to bring it to the grave, even though they couldn't be there. So these are just ways, that to support each other.
That's very beautiful. Wow.
I wanted to underline one thing about the green burial and why it might be helpful in this time is that, in New York, the levels of cremations being needed are so intense and so much that the crematoriums are backed up for weeks and weeks, So if someone is cremated, they may not even be cremated until the end of May or even June. And that has its own suffering for everyone. And so any time where we might be facing a time where cremations are going to be backed up and people can turn back again to burial as a possibility. And in small rural areas like where I live, the family totally could be there. They had isolated themselves around Reenie, who did not die of COVID, but just she died of cancer. But the family was able to be there. And even with social distancing, to dig the grave, the young couples staggered coming in to dig the grave. So 2 at a time would be digging, and then they would leave, and then another 2 would come, and they would leave. And so that they were able to honor the cemetery's social distancing rules. So there are many ways. Sarah Cruz, who owns Heartland Prairie Cemetery, she has done 2 green burials where she and her husband just come out. They were masked, and they came out and just gave shovels, to the family and told them the parameters of what they wanted to happen. And then they just left, and the family was able to dig the grave and to mourn together and plant seeds on the grave afterwards, because that's what they do at the Prairie Cemetery. So you can see how this is a direct possibility to being so removed from someone.
Yes, definitely. And so good for people to remember all of the alternatives out there and reimagining what's possible and being creative in the moment with what is available to us, with what's possible right now.
Yes. And families, I would underline that, with the time of COVID, they're going to be like being able to be hands-on like this. It can be more difficult doing the paperwork oneself with vital statistics offices closed. Bringing your own person to a crematorium may not be possible now, because you might be bringing family members who might be infected to a facility. All of those things have to be taken into consideration now when thinking of having a home funeral or green burial. But there's ways to do it, to just adjust and honor, the new parameters, but work within it.
And Lucinda, I wanted to let listeners know about a resource I saw on your website. It's a checklist for planning a home funeral or green burial. And how can people get that?
So if you go to my website, it's actually www.lucindaherring.com. And if you join my mailing list, then you receive that booklet, and it's actually quite detailed. It gives you a lot of information on what you would need if you're thinking of doing a home vigil. And I'm thinking, it would be a good resource for someone who might find that they're in the position of having someone at home, to just sign up for that and receive it. The other wonderful resource would be going to the National Home Funeral Alliance, because there's so many resources there. In fact, they have a new whole pandemic resource section. But, so many ideas, like I was describing, about how to honor someone who might be lying at home at a time when you didn't expect that, how to have rituals and bring beauty and art and nature into the room and help comfort everyone. So that's the National Home Funeral Alliance. And my book, I'm going to be the audiobook of my book with my reading it, which is a great coup. I was able to manage that. I was so happy about that. Will be coming out May 19th. And, that can be something that you could receive without having to wait to buy the book or, I imagine it can be comforting. Yeah.
And I'll leave links in the show notes for this podcast episode where people can access all those things and even find where they can purchase your audiobook too, Lucinda.
Great. Yes. Yeah. And I think it'd be good to have the links like to the Green Burial Council and, to other things that can help support people to think about where they might be able to have a green burial in this time. Like they may have wanted a conventional burial or cremation, but now they're thinking that maybe they would have more opportunity to be hands-on with their loved one during COVID. And there's Ann Hoffner has this natural burial cemetery guide. She's revised it, and it's coming out again, the second revision at the end of May, I believe. And that has resources for where green burials are possible in every state. And I think that would be really good for people to have if they're, considering that maybe green burial is a way to go to help ease the separation and suffering that's happening right now.
So that's another great resource. I'll link to all of these in the show notes then. So that'll make it easier for everyone to find these great resources. Thank you for sharing that, Lucinda. And thanks so much for taking time out to talk with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's so helpful, isn't it, to be together and talk and share our thoughts. And thank you so much, Karen, for this opportunity.
Oh, well, you're welcome. And it really is in this time when we're all feeling isolated, the times we do get to be together and connect feel very precious. And so I'm so grateful that we had this hour together, Lucinda, and I hope that we get to see each other face to face someday before too long.
I do too. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you and take care.
You too. Be well.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Lucinda Herring. I loved everything about it. I loved discussing how families who have a loved one die at home, who are not prepared to keep the body at home for many hours, can actually make something beautiful out of that experience and view it as a gift. Also, the conversation about how COVID-19 is forcing us to reweave death into our lives and into our medical system. That was a comment from Lucinda, and she described a doctor who wrote about staring into the eyes of his patients deeply before he intubates them as a way of connecting with them and getting to know them. And Lucinda called it staring into the eyes of death. And it really does inspire me that this COVID-19 pandemic, as awful as it has been, is going to change our medical system. It really is waking up a large portion of our hospital-based medical providers to the day-to-day reality and presence of death. And I think that it will have some positive changes down the road once we're through all of this. So I hope that you found some comfort and inspiration in our conversation. If you enjoy this content on my podcast, I hope that you'll tell others about it and share episodes with them. Also, if you feel so inclined, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen. It makes a big difference in terms of how many people get to see this content when they're searching for it. So remember, I return every Friday with a story, Love Over Fear, Stories for Precarious Times. And every Monday, I'll be back with a new episode in the podcast. So join me again in the future. I look forward to it. Until then, remember that we're here for love. That's really what this is all about. So face your fear. Be ready for whatever life brings you next, and love each and every moment of this precious and fleeting life. Bye-bye.